Hi, I'm here today to talk about some of my research in the history and politics of technology, specifically looking at the expansion of low-power FM radio. You're probably thinking, wait, radio, why are we talking about radio? It's 2011. What's the deal with that? But this is something I really want to point out, is that often when we think about new media and its relationship with old media, it's very easy and simplistic for us to imagine that new media supplants old media and old media dies, and that's kind of the end of the story. In fact, this is rarely the case. These new and old forms of media can exist together, sometimes in coexistence, sometimes in dynamic tension, but it's rarely the case that old media totally goes away or stops developing just because of the arrival of new media. With radio and the specific history of radio, we want to start in the 1920s, thinking about when broadcasting first came on the scene. From its earliest days, there were contestations over the best uses of radio and the meaning of radio broadcasting. Who should have access, whether it should be networked and reach a wide audience, whether it should be commercial, whether it should be nonprofit, whether it should be educational, whether it should be locally controlled. All those issues are as old as radio, and they don't totally go away. But in recent years, there's been a real surge in opening up these questions. In the late 70s, the government stopped issuing licenses for low-power, small-scale community broadcasting. So this meant that if you were a school group or a community center and you wanted to get a license to start a radio station, you flat out could not. And so as a result, some people started taking to the airwaves in the 80s and 90s in explicit acts of electronic civil disobedience and basically, flouting the law and saying, we don't agree with this policy. And what this slide illustrates is a small radio transmitter mounted inside a lunchbox. So it's small, it's obviously portable, it's easy to operate, pretty accessible, and potentially ubiquitous. And this really stands in contrast to how we usually think of radio, which has these large-scale, networked, capital-intensive, big equipment and out of reach of everyday people, sort of an artifact. But what I want to stress here is that this is not something inherent about radio. This is radio as we've collectively chosen to build it. So moving forward, the other reason there's been an increased attention to the uses and meaning of radio recently is that in 1996, a law passed in the US that had a big effect on media policy, and especially on radio. It meant that people who wanted radio stations, who owned radio stations already and wanted to acquire more, suddenly could. Before 1996, the cap at a national level was 40. You couldn't have 41. It wasn't permitted. But after 1996, unlimited ownership was actually allowed at the national level. And so this very quickly led to a massive increase. From 1996 to 2001, a single company acquired over 1,200 radio stations. So this is really an enormous increase. And this concentration of radio also led a lot of people to say, maybe there's something wrong with this, especially given that radio is maybe ideally suited to local control. It's perhaps ironic and very problematic that radio is so concentrated and out of reach for people who want stations. So in 2000 and 2001, the government reversed policy again and started issuing a new class of licenses called low power FM, LPFMs. And they made available these for small community groups, and they're non-commercial, and they operate, as the name suggests, at a low power. It means they don't reach more than a few miles, and so they're ideally suited for neighborhood use, small town use. They wouldn't travel very far if you wanted to. That's not what they're intended for. And so since then, about 950 of these new stations have already been built, and in early 2011, Obama signed a new law where we will now be able to build up to a couple more thousand nationwide. So that's going on in the background. You're maybe thinking again, though, wait, radio stations, 3,000 of them nationally. Why is this so important, and what kind of an impact can this have? Especially talking about new media, the internet is so accessible. If you want to have a platform to make your voice heard, you can get on Twitter, you can get on social media, you can have a blog, you can have a website, right? And it seems like these radio stations, there are never going to be that many of them. However, what I want to suggest is that this apparent drawback is actually potentially an advantage for radio, because the scarcity forces communities that have radio stations to make decisions about how to use them. And the sort of local control exercised by community members democratically basically means that these radio stations do something that every single person having their own outlet to say whatever they want doesn't do. It's different. And so therefore, I want to say that when we're thinking about, comparing media technologies, which one's better, we're rarely ever thinking about the sort of technical properties in isolation. And when we say which one's better, the internet is better or radio is better, what we really mean is better for a certain purpose, right? So we have to think about what we really mean and not think of the technologies in isolation from social, political, and cultural values that we inscribe in them. So that's it. I hope I've given you some reasons to think about radio in the digital age slightly differently. Thank you.